Then you have the intimidation of educators. Yeah. So teachers, headmasters are brought in, tortured, humiliated, and said, either you start teaching the Russian curriculum or we're going to hurt you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GNSI video series. My name is Golfo Alexopoulos. I'm a professor at USF in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies, and I'm also director of USF's Institute for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies. It gives me great pleasure today to speak with Peter Pomerantsev. Peter Pomerantsev is a highly acclaimed author and expert on Russian disinformation and influence operations, which he has been studying for many years. He is the author most recently of the highly acclaimed book, How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler. Tell us a little bit about your work. I know generally you've written several really highly acclaimed works on Russian disinformation. Tell us a little bit about your past research and now the direction of your current work.
Sure. I mean, I started writing about sort of developments in propaganda around 10 years ago. I was actually working in television, worked in Britain, in Russia, seeing the Putin propaganda machine emerge. And then at one point I realized that I was actually more interested in writing about propaganda than working in TV. I preferred writing to other genres, and started writing about it. And then, but very much sort of as a sort of nonfiction author, which I still am. But as I started writing about the topic, wrote one book, then another book, then I realized I just wanted to do something about it. And so I set up a little research unit at the LSE first, London School of Economics, now at Johns Hopkins. We're basically, we try to work out how to combat some of the nastier forms of authoritarian propaganda. So that's the two things I kind of do. I carry on looking at the subjects, I carry on writing about it, I have a new book out about Nazi propaganda. But at the same time, my kind of university work is more focused about what we do about it from a legal point of view, which is very, very complicated, as we all know, but also from a counter-messaging point of view.
Do you think we're good at identifying what exactly disinformation is? And could you describe the ambiguity around that and how you characterize disinformation?
Yeah, actually, I have to say disinformation is an unhelpful term for several reasons. One of them, it's very hard to define conceptually. But frankly, legally as well, So the emergence of laws and legal ideas around disinformation is very tricky. Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily malign, but it is very, very tricky. There is nothing in the Declaration of Human Rights around stopping disinformation. It's just the free flow of information, and we see those complications bubbling up in the debate about censorship today. So it's unhelpful from that kind of like theoretical and legal point of view, but much more so for me, who looks at propaganda, which we can define as sort of the attempt to influence people to think and behave in a certain way that is beneficial to the person conducting the propaganda. So if we define it that way, disinformation is really only a tiny bit of the issue, and we've ended up focusing on it and kind of missing the wood from the trees. This is not actually a competition between information and disinformation, even if we could define disinformation. It's about narratives, worldviews, forms of identity, and so on. That's what, as a propagandist, you're doing. You're not thinking, oh, I'll create some disinformation. You're not. You're creating, whole systems of looking at the world that manipulate certain types of desires. It's much closer to art and storytelling, on top of which you can layer in some lies. But that's actually the last thing you add. That's a little drop you might add right at the end. So not only is it legally a complex issue, in terms of sort of battling the problem, we've ended up not over-focusing, but like spending a huge amount of effort on almost things which are never going to be very effective, like fact checking or debunking, which are good. They're good things to do. I don't in any way want to undermine their goodness, but that's not what this is about. So I don't think it's a very useful term, and now it's become a very divisive term, and now it's become a partisan term, and now it's become a geopolitical term.
So you prefer propaganda? You prefer that term?
We can call, in my second book, This Is Not Propaganda, I avoided the term propaganda because that too is a very infected term. It's a term that's become sort of, people just use it to say anything they don't like. Your propaganda, like your propaganda. But actually, if you go back to its kind of like roots, it's probably what we're really talking about here. But we could talk about geopolitical information confrontation. We can talk about even psyops is in some cases. But disinformation is it sort of misses the point. I mean, look, take the one thing that was a reference point for modern activities. The Russian attempt to influence the 2016 election, which is very well documented. A combination of hacks and leaks of the Democratic National Convention, these mean sort of campaigns online. Only a tiny bit of that is disinformation. Most of it was taking real information and then distributing it in a way that was very, very destructive. And even the stuff online, the Facebook ads that were being pushed out by the Russians, which were like, Trump, beautiful, Hillary, evil. That's not disinformation. That's just, pushing a certain emotion. So even there, where is the disinformation there if we're trying to combat disinformation? Unless you start talking about disinformation as behavior, sort of deceptive behavior. But that's not what people mean when they say disinformation. So look, it's not a very useful term, and now the term has become so contentious that it's almost become a distraction, I'd say.
So why do you think it's important to combat it if it's nothing? Well, it is malicious, right? Even if it's true, if it's done in a malicious way or if it's done for malicious ends, why do you think that this is a sphere of global activity that we should pay attention to and combat?
Sure. Look, you have to talk about effects. Sometimes the effect is to destroy the chance of any kind of democratic discourse. So much confusion and hatred and enmity that, this elusive idea of a democratic public sphere is trashed and breaks down. I saw that happen in Russia when I lived there. The propaganda was around seeding so much doubt and suspicion, people couldn't talk to each other anymore. You get vicious polarization, evidence disappears as a way of talking about policy. And it's, if you have, especially in America, where you have an idea of the Constitution very much rooted in idea of debate and contention and argument around a common set of definitions, that's probably not going to survive. So this sort of sometimes this is called like information disorder or something, but that's one effect. That's a very grand effect. But then there are very, very concrete ones. I mean, Russia and China use a mixture of unpleasant propaganda campaigns, corruption, mercenaries, in order to push France and America out of the Sahel and capture vital minerals so they can, dominate those vital resources, use them for manufacturing cheaper iPhones, dumping them on the European market and bankrupting America. So, it is part of a political and even military effect. So we have to think about the effect rather than the thing in itself. I do think it can be a complete distraction chasing after every lie. You have to understand what is the purpose of the campaign that's being waged and how do we mitigate that? But look, we live in a world where there's been an information revolution. Obviously, that has opened up the possibility to use these new information tools in ways that are advantageous to our enemies and very, very corrosive to any kind of hope for democracy.
Let's talk about mitigation, because you mentioned that fact-checking is not helpful and debunking is not helpful.
No, it can be. It's just limited. Yeah.
Right. What do you think some other methods? Have you identified some other methods, pre-bunking or that you think are more effective or can be more effective?
Yeah, I think the only thing that is effective is competing at the end of the day. So you have to create better, better content. You could, whether that's better journalism, whether it's better influence campaigns. It depends what you're trying to achieve. You've got to get good at this stuff yourself. And then we can get into the difference. What is the difference between an authoritarian approach and a democratic approach? And I explore a lot of that in my last book. But at the end of the day, you have to be better than the other side. And that's the kind of, you're always going to end up there, simply because there are things you can do from the legal side. Yeah, we can create a better information environment that is more conducive to democratic discourse, whether that's designing better online platforms that actually encourage an evidence-based debate rather than online mobs that seek to sort of, destroy people. We can talk about the limited, but I think very important role of legal regulation. But at the end of the day, a bad actor will always find a way through. And at the end of the day, you have to compete.
So I'd like to talk about your current work on war crimes. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the things that I helped launch at the start of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine was an NGO that combines lawyers and journalists, two groups of people that don't always work together, but that we felt that in this case could pack a bigger punch for truth and justice. So we have a team of journalists on the ground in Ukraine, obviously Ukrainians, collecting evidence of war crimes, testimonies, and then that gets funneled in two directions. To the lawyers in London and Berlin who build cases, submissions to international institutions, and then to me and the media team who do stories with that evidence. So that's a kind of innovative way to combine these two sectors in a more focused and strategic way. But one of the things that we've been looking at a lot the last few months, or last year actually, is firstly the legal accountability of Russian propagandists. Because there are some legal measures that I think you can take. I think there is a difference. Historically, there's always been a difference between criminality and free speech. It's very hard to define these sort of very controversial terms like hate speech. Incitement to violence is very hard to sort of, really pinpoint. Incitement to genocide, even harder. So a lot of people focus on that, on the speech parts. And that I think is actually a difficult way. So in our research, what we focused on is kind of more specifically, like what is new about this information environment that might open up the path to new standards of legal accountability. And what we've been specifically looking at is not types of speech, not like nasty things that Russians say, even though there's plenty of that, but it's actually the specific use of information operations to aid and abet war crimes. So in the run-up to the bombing of a hospital, there'll be a campaign which is coordinated. Yeah? Not people saying something randomly. The coordinated online campaign by online actors that we believe are essentially parts of the security services, aiding and abetting that war crime. Yeah, they will be saying there are soldiers in a hospital when they know there's not, in order to make it possible to bomb it. Or they will be saying the Ukrainians are about to bomb their own prisoner of war camp in order to do it themselves. So creating what some call information alibis. And so what we're looking very specifically is these information operations, which, given their consistency and given the pattern of people who are always involved in them, point to a conscious participation in very specific war crimes. So that's I'm not one of the lawyers. There's a big legal team that looks at the legal theory around it. There is obviously some precedent for this, but it's something that becomes much more possible in the online environment. Yeah, because back in the days of radio or something, a Nazi broadcaster like Hans Fritzsche, the head of Nazi broadcasting, would say horrible things. And then they would be brought to trial, as Hans Fritzsche was in Nuremberg. And he'd say, but I had no idea about what was being committed. I had no idea. Yes, I said some bad things about Jews, but I had no idea about the about the Holocaust. Oh my God, terrible things, absolutely terrible. And you would never be able to prove that they were part of that process. Yeah. And they would get away with it. Propagandists usually get away with it because free speech. But here, I think the digital environment allows us to say, look, you can see the spike in activity the days before the war crime. Yeah, it's always the same people. We kind of know much more now who these different online accounts belong to, and so on and so forth. Because you can track the activity. It's not just a guy saying one thing once. You can actually follow the arc of it. You can see how it spikes right before the war crime. You can say with a lot more certainty that this is probably part of an operation, and the propagandists know exactly what they're doing. So that's all. So that's some of the research we've been doing.
So even if they don't have data on what actually is happening on the ground, the fact that these propagandists are dehumanizing and maligning a group of people, doesn't that set up the conditions for genocide?
So that's a different legal theory, and friends of mine in Ukraine have done a submission to The Hague around that, around saying yes, that's the more famous propagandists who compare Ukrainians to vermin, say Ukraine needs to be dewormed, use this language right out of the Nazi playbook. That's their claim, that those words lead to persecution in the occupied territories. Again, the difficulty always is nailing the connection. Yes, they might know, you might get them for genocidal speech, but that's not the same thing as saying that they are directly involved and responsible for the persecution. No, I'm all for that approach. That's the kind of classical approach.
Yeah.
And it's just I'm not the lawyer, but the way I understand it, it's still a very high bar to get over. You still have to sort of like get their connection to the persecution. What's the much easier one to do, which is what the EU did when they sanctioned loads of Russian media, which say, look, these propagandists are clearly involved in a war of aggression. Yeah, they are. Right. They are undermining Ukraine's territorial integrity,
and they're an arm of the state.
And they're
so they
clearly
can't
an arm
be
of the state. Yeah,
decoupled.
the state media.
Right.
So and so that's one thing to get them on. For sanctions, the term war propaganda hasn't actually been defined very clearly. If you're looking at this from a legal point of view, there are some countries that ban war propaganda. War being a war of aggression. But again, that's all ways of focusing on types of speech. We're doing something different. We're actually starting with the crime and working out whether the propagandists played an active role in making that crime possible. So it's a very different approach. We're starting with the victim. The problem with a lot of, these attempts to sort of like define types of speech is really working out the connection between the speech and the much far off action. I mean, they're not giving orders to the soldiers, So creating conditions. There's definitely there's a track record of cases that manage to nail propagandists for incitement to genocide, incitement to violence, but fairly rare.
Really,
because a bit in Rwanda.
In Rwanda, though,
but that's hardly anything.
Yeah,
Rwanda, a little bit in Yugoslavia, and obviously
Myanmar. Was that no?
I can't remember, but it's not as common as you would think. Yeah.
What about the way that Russian authorities, the Kremlin, sows doubt about war crimes? I heard a interview with Lavrov recently where he said, Bucha, we keep asking for the names of these people, just to sow doubt and make it sound like it's staged and so on. How effective do you think this is? How problematic is it for countries that are trying to prosecute war crimes to deal with the perpetrators who just make up these stories all the time and sow doubt? What do you think about the way that, how effective is Russia in muddying the waters and making it look like there were no war crimes? The war crimes were either committed by Ukraine, or they were staged, or they were exaggerated, or they were false.
Yeah,
what do you think?
Propaganda, it depends what we mean by effective. In terms of that story spreading and seeping into non-Russian discourse, I mean, among Europe and the Allies, with the exception of maybe Hungary and Bulgaria, where state propaganda echoes this, up until now, I didn't think it was much of an issue, frankly. But now everything is changing. Now, propaganda is as strong as the people who repeat it. It's always a networked issue. And when you start having question marks raised about who started the war and, whose fault it is, and then, the whole sort of like the whole ground of responsibility is muddied. But to be clear, what we're looking at is less the stuff that happens afterwards. By the time that they're doing a mopping up, by the time a Lavrov is trying to mop up after MH17 or Bucha, they've got a problem. That's them trying to cover up a war crime, maybe a crime against humanity, and definitely a disaster. What we're talking about is the a priori, when it's done a priori in order to really muddy the waters, because then you're doing stuff before something happens. So you're really confusing people. Again, like, who are the audiences? Are they doing it for the domestic audience? Are they doing it for the international audience? Are they doing it because they know perfectly well they will, Russia does have obligations to the UN. It does have a seat there. So the more they can say, look, we've been telling you for weeks that the Ukrainians have been blowing up their own dam. It's not us. So there's many places where it's very useful to have these information alibis. It's not always about belief. It can just be about, giving yourself that space in order to give yourself implausible deniability, but that's still very important in some fora. And again, it's all about power. At one point, the Allies start saying, well, we just don't know, do we? We just don't know. I mean, probably, but let's give them a chance. So it's very important to have these sort of spaces. And in that sense, it is a way of minimizing and mitigating responsibility.
Can you speak more about what exactly Russia is doing in the occupied territory and what acts of cultural genocide and other forms of genocide are they perpetrating there? What has your team discovered?
So thank you very much for asking about this, because I think that there's a real risk, especially as we enter these unorthodox peace negotiations that seem to be looming onto us, that we forget that this is not just a war for territory. This is not about like, ooh, Russia wants a slice of the Donbass and we can negotiate around that. The essence of Russia's invasion is to crush Ukrainian identity, which is something they've been trying to do for hundreds of years. This is the latest iteration of a conflict that's been lasting for many hundreds of years. And you do that not just by seizing territory, by then breaking people's Ukrainian identity and kind of installing a Russianized one. And I think we miss that. I think we sort of forget that this is not just about territory, let alone about NATO expansion. This is, Russia's age-old ambition to crush Ukrainian identity and the right to define who they are. And you really see that in the occupied territories. And sort of several phases to the work. First, there's destruction of books, libraries, museums. I mean, when the Russians come, they kind of grab all the Ukrainian textbooks from the library, pile them in these kind of mountains of pages, kerosene them, and set them alight. They loot the local museums and cultural centers, not because they're necessarily stealing the artifacts, but because they want to get rid of any kind of memory of local folklore and local history.
Are those being destroyed too?
No, they're always being destroyed. They're being taken away. I mean, that's often for the safety. These things, got to get rid of them. Or sometimes say we just don't want to see any Ukrainian embroidery, no Ukrainian, no Ukrainian language literature, just get rid of it. It's gone. And then they bring in tons of Russian books and replace them. So it depends. Sometimes if it's Scythian gold, it'll be taken away to a museum somewhere else. Sometimes it's just destroyed. So that's just phase one. Yeah. Then you have the intimidation of educators. Yeah. So teachers, headmasters are brought in, tortured, humiliated, and said, either you start teaching the Russian curriculum or we're going to hurt you. Parents are intimidated, saying you've got to start sending, well, obviously you have to start sending your kids to the Russian schools because all the schools become Russian schools, the curriculum becomes Russian, Ukrainian textbook become extremist literature. So if you have a Ukrainian history or politics textbook, you can be arrested and put in jail for many years for reading that. Ukrainian online education is banned. It's not as if you can do sort of Ukrainian lessons online. Parents are sort of told that they will lose their children if they carry on doing this. So, so there's destruction of culture. There's the intimidation, torture of school teachers. There's the forcing kids to undergo Russian education. And this is not just like here's a new course. I mean, if you don't follow the new Russian textbooks, patriotism, songs, celebration of Putin, textbooks where kind of Ukrainian history is minimized, where the Ukrainian national project is dismissed as a puppet of the West or a Nazi project. If you don't do that, kids are beaten up, they're humiliated, they're denied all sorts of basic rights to a full education and a right to their identity. And then, as a kind of really creepy final twist, there's the militarized education. So Ukrainian kids are put through these military training programs, a bit like the Hitlerjugend, essentially, lots of singing of patriotic songs, learning how to kill, hating other Ukrainians, and then drafted in the Russian army to kill other Ukrainians. So you're taking Ukrainians, indoctrinating them, and then getting them to kill the people who were living in a village down the road. So literally, you are destroying Ukrainians to the point where they are killing each other. Now, there are many kind of rights violations as you go through that. Freedom of speech, freedom to identity, freedom of the rights of the child. You're definitely not allowed to take people in occupied territories and force them into your army. That's against Geneva Conventions from the 19th century. But what nobody has done is connect all these up into one program, because actually this is one program, which is the destruction of identity, which is sometimes referred to as cultural genocide. But if you go back to the 1930s, you go back to after the Second World War, 1930s and 1940s, yeah, when Raphael Lemkin, the man who came up with the concept of genocide, this great lawyer who really defined our idea of evil, when he first came up with the idea of genocide, he had cultural genocide and the destruction of identity top. He saw that as one of the main issues.
So it's in the Genocide Convention and it can be prosecuted, right?
No. It was in his original Genocide Convention, partly because he'd seen what the Soviets had done to the Ukrainians in the 1920s and 30s.
Interesting.
It was in his original one, which he brought to the convention, which I think was 1948 in Paris. He brings it there. And the cultural identity bit is taken out by every country. Because
we're
everybody's
complicit.
done a little bit of it. The Americans took it out. The British took it out. The French took it out. The Soviets did their own manipulations. The Swedes took it out because they'd done horrible things to Laplanders in the north. Every colonial power has done some form of this, and they all freaked out when they saw it.
Wow.
The people who supported it were the Indians, the African states, and all those. But all the Europeans threw it out. And the Genocide Convention became what we know today, which is the physical destruction of a group. Yeah. And Lemkin was heartbroken. He said that the delegates to the UN had made a sin with history, and history would never forgive them. And so actually this range of activities remains undefined. And in a legal way, which is also kind of a cultural way in the sense that we need legal ideas to define that something is bad. Until we call domestic violence illegal, it's sort of in this gray area. Because we don't have a legal term for this, we kind of miss the ultimate aim of Russia's invasion. So I don't think we can bring cultural genocide back. For that, you need a re-ratification of the culture of the Genocide Convention. We're clearly not at that moment in history. So what we've been trying to do at The Reckoning, which is the name of the project that I helped create, is fine, okay, so how can you use different legal mechanisms to nail this?
That is so important. That is such important work.
No, very hard, very, very complicated, but very important because we're kind of missing. Well, firstly, we're not letting the victims express what's happening to them. Ukrainians are kind of in agony because, they feel that they're losing 1.5 million kids who are in the occupied territories. Yeah, this is not the kids who are being abducted to Russia. Yeah, that is clearly a crime. But the kids who are just there and whose identity is being wiped out, they feel that they can't protect them. They have no way to talk about that form of violation. So it's very important for the victims to find a language for it, but also very important for perpetrators to sort of say who the perpetrators are. Because we don't look at the sort of, the masters of indoctrination. They're never in our sights. We think about the generals and the people who launch chemical weapons, or maybe the nastiest types of propagandists. We don't think about the people who put together the indoctrination curriculum, who create the youth groups. They always kind of slide out of, the post-war world. They sort of go back into society, when actually what they're doing is the essence of this invasion and so many others. Think about what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. I mean, that is another massive enforced indoctrination process. Think about what's happening in Ethiopia. I mean, there are cases like this everywhere. And yet we're calling
this genocide. We have Congress calling the what's happening against the Uyghurs in China a genocide.
So, but not this. I mean, this bit of it would be, that's a different bit of it. So the genocide would be, and genocide is always tied to physical destruction.
Physical, okay. I want to ask you about Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion, because I wonder if Ukrainians felt this cultural extermination project, if they felt it viscerally when they were resisting the Russian invaders. Do you think it's something that they were acquainted with or knew about? I mean, of course, Russia's, the Soviet project was very much about taming Ukrainian nationalism. But do you think that the Ukrainians' understanding of this imperialist project informed their ways of resistance?
So look, the main resistance at the moment is of course military, because there's a physical war going on. No, I mean, and there's very inspiring stories of resistance from within the occupied territories. Whether that's, something I didn't mention right now is religious freedoms. That's a very big part of what Russia is doing as well. So you have kind of, Ukraine, for many reasons, has become kind of like this wonderful melting pot of different religions. A lot of evangelicals came there, a lot of Protestants came there, a lot of Baptists came there. And Ukraine is one of the most sort of diverse societies religiously in the region. Now, obviously, the Russians won't have any of that. Evangelicals especially are seen as American spies. So, if you're an evangelical, you must be an American spy. That's a foreign religion. They're seized. Many are tortured, many killed, many expelled. But people are still meeting in their rooms, in flats, and gathering, saying things. People are still getting Ukrainian education online in secret. There's little movements of sort of teenagers who, graffiti Ukrainian flags in different places. So there are these attempts of resistance. Many people also leave. There is a way out of the occupied territories, but not everybody can leave, especially if they have elder family or if they are older. So people do try to resist, and I think those stories are often missed. Ukrainians in the non-occupied parts are really focused on the drones that come at them every day. But of course, there's also been a kind of like a revival of Ukrainian language literature. My cousin's a publisher in Ukraine. And he always did it out of kind of, love of literature. But suddenly he said it's a business. It's just, he's sort of like, oh, wow. I mean, he publishes quite sort of like,
so there's a big demand
trendy
for
modernist
these.
literature, and
Right.
suddenly like it's exploded.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, I want to ask you about Ukraine's future. The great Ukrainian historian Serhiy Plokhy said once in an interview that he thinks ultimately Ukraine will succeed because the colonized always are always victorious in colonial wars. There's liberation is inevitable at some point for the Ukrainians. Do you think that's true? What is your sense of the future of Ukraine,
Well, look,
the country of your birth?
part of the reason Putin started this war was, I think, because he felt that Ukraine was slipping. Already a generation were coming into being that were successful, entrepreneurial, Ukrainian, and that old Soviet legacy was sort of wilting away. I think that was one of the, I think he realized that, he, for his own reasons, he wanted to act now. I don't know anything about inevitability. I think the reality is that this is not the first time that Russia has tried to crush Ukraine, but overall it's the least successful time. Yeah. So Ukraine, for all the tragedy, has managed to keep its sovereignty. And the essence of this sovereignty is having an army that can fight the Russians, which is why Ukrainians are so jittery about, the current White House doing ceasefires behind their back and constantly referencing the idea that Putin made some sort of serious offer of peace 2 years ago. The most damaging part of Putin's demands, and there were many, nothing to do with NATO. It was this idea that Ukraine should be demilitarized. Yeah? That it should be what is sometimes called neutral and sometimes called like Finlandization. So Finland in the Cold War was utterly penetrated. Yeah? Totally penetrated. What Putin means is a demilitarized Ukraine which had not decided its own fate and has no sovereignty, where Putin decides all the foreign policy decision, where Putin decides who is in the power ministries, where all the ministries are totally captured. Yeah? That's the aim.
Speaking of ministries, which are the ministries that are controlling this cultural genocide, this project in Russia? Yeah,
that's a very interesting question. So we've been mapping stuff on the ground. The next question will be start to sort of build up the full tower of responsibility. But it always seems to go back to Kiriyenko. So everything in Russia goes back to the presidential administration. Mm-hmm. So Kiriyenko is one of the heads of the presidential administration, and he seems to have part of this agenda. Then all bucks sort of stop with him. But you're quite right. That would be the next thing for us to map. We've been looking at the activities on the ground and the reality, but it's clearly pre-prepared. Yeah, and there'll be people in the educational structure. There'll be people in the Ministry of Culture structure. But everything always goes back to the presidential administration.
That concludes this episode of the GNSI video series. Thanks to Peter Pomerantsev for joining us. My name is Golfo Alexopoulos, and I thank you all for listening.